I'm Michelle Carpenter. I'm a nursing consultant with the College of Registered Nurses in Newfoundland and Labrador, and I'm the lead for nurse practitioner practice. And I guess I just want to start off the presentation by saying, unfortunately, this presentation is not on the new scope of practice document. It was intended to go to Council in February. However, it did not go forward as intended. We got a significant amount of feedback, and the consultation indicated that the document was too long. So what we decided to do is pull the document that was moving forward, and we're going to break it down into a suite of scope documents. So we're going to have a scope of practice framework, practice guidelines. We're going to have fact sheets and practice supports to align with our new website. And during that time, there's a lot of decisions of not moving forward. And one of the reasons that contributed was the new framework and the new website. So the principles are the same. So I will introduce some of the new principles that will be coming forward in the new scope of practice framework. And these principles apply to your scope. And many of the principles I am going to present today currently apply to your practice. So the college regulates the nursing profession, as you all know, and the mandate of CRNNL is to protect the public through self-regulation of the profession. And we do that through the RN Act and the RN regulations. And healthcare professionals and others are regulated when there is substantial risk of harm if care is performed inappropriately. So government says that these healthcare professionals have to be regulated. But who sets the scope of practice for RNs and NPs in Newfoundland? Well, the provincial government has granted the college the privilege or the authority of self-regulation, and as such, through the RN Act and RN regulations, has provided CRNNL Council the authority to set the standards and the scope of practice of RNs and NPs in Newfoundland and Labrador. And most recently, in December 6, 2020, the provincial government opened the RN Act to allow CRNNL Council to set the scope of RNs, to set the scope of practice of RNs, and this will entail that RN prescribing will be coming into the scope of practice of specific RNs in the near future. And Peggy is the lead for that project. So many years ago, there was a list of competencies that RNs could perform. So where is the list? Well, the RN Act does not limit or differentiate the type of a client an RN is authorized to care for or limit the environment where that care occurs. So within their scope of practice, RNs and NPs may autonomously provide care regardless of the complexity of client care or predictability of client outcomes. So CRNNL, since the 2006 scope of practice document came into effect, we no longer maintain a list of competencies. And this is due to the individual and changing nature of RN and NP scope of practice. So currently in Newfoundland and Labrador, the scope of practice of RNs and NPs is very broad and is based upon three key elements: education, authorization, and competence. And we're going to take a closer look at those in the upcoming slides. So what are some factors that influence the scope of practice of nursing in Newfoundland and Labrador? So in Newfoundland and Labrador, the scope of practice of the profession is impacted by the RN Act, as I've said, the RN regulations. Government has laid out the expectations from a legislative requirement of what CRNNL Council is expected to do, and they've imparted the operationalization of the two pieces of legislation to the college staff. And we have developed documents to address those expectations. There are other laws that are relevant. There's provincial and federal legislation that governs and affects and impacts the scope of practice of RNs and NPs. We have our college's standards of practice, which lays out the minimum expectations for practice and our standards of practice. We have our code of ethics. The CRNNL Council has endorsed the Canadian Nurses Association Code of Ethics, and we're expected to meet those expectations, and other relevant college documents. And we have a new website, which I'll talk a little bit more about at the end of the presentation, where all of those documents that affect your scope of practice are contained under our practice resources. And further, individual scope of practice is influenced by the needs and healthcare goals of the client, the specific competencies required of the RN. So those necessary knowledge, skills, and judgments and personal attributes that are required to provide care for your client needs. The practice setting. There are certain settings that you may be authorized to perform skills and others that you may not. And there's also employer authorization to perform specific nursing competencies. And that authorization comes through employer policies, job descriptions, care directives, practice guidelines, just to name a few. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in the upcoming slides. So as I said, our current scope of practice document is dated, it's 2006, and it is being revised, and we've had one consultation, but many of the principles are relevant, or I should say all of the principles are relevant, and we have fine-tuned them into the most relevant and current evidence for the scope of practice document. And as I said, we'll be creating a scope or suite of scope documents. So currently, as I said, we have a new website for the college, and the practice resources or the documents that CRNNL has created is found under the hamburger up on top on the right hand side when you go into the website. If you click on that little hamburger, it's like 3 distorted lines. And our scope document is found under practice resources under practice topics. Or you can search for the document on our search engine that is there at the top. And as I said, we're currently revising our scope document. There'll be a suite of documents, and there'll even be some one-pagers for quick and easy reference when you just want to pull out, am I allowed to do that? When you have that question at 12 o'clock midnight, and you want to be able to readily get the answer, am I allowed to do that? So according to the college, we have defined scope of practice as the range of roles, functions, responsibilities, and accountabilities which RNs and NPs are educated and authorized to perform to assist clients to achieve health. And a scope of practice document or statement identifies the boundary of a discipline. So it's what you're allowed to do as a registered nurse or a nurse practitioner, what is within your individual scope of practice. So at the college, if you've attended any of our presentations or heard any of our talks, we often differentiate the different scopes of practice using circles. And when we look at this circle, we'll start from the smallest circle, the gray circle there on the bottom, which is the scope of practice of the newly graduated RN and NP. And the scope of practice of the newly graduated nurse, the beginning practitioner, from a practical perspective, is the smallest or most limited scope of practice. And it represents the roles and functions and responsibilities and activities that students learn in their entry to practice nursing education program. And nursing education programs curricula prepare nurses to entry-level competencies upon graduation. And these ELCs are the necessary knowledge, skills, and judgment required to enter into practice and provide safe, competent, compassionate, and ethical care in nursing practice. And they provide the foundation for nursing practice and represents a new practitioner's initial expected level of competence or individual scope of practice for a new graduating nurse. And as the new graduate goes to a practice setting, they come with those entry-level competencies, but they'll learn through experience, through orientation, through mentorship, professional practice, and continuing education. And then they'll start to develop a individual scope of practice. And what does that mean? So that white circle now, the inner circle, the individual scope of practice of an RN or MP. And this is defined as the nursing services for which a registrant is educated, authorized, and competent to perform. And an individual RN or MP scope of practice is based on foundational entry to practice education and continues to progress with practice experience and continuing education over a career. And so the RNs and MPs add to their scope of practice as they progress through their careers from a novice to expert practitioner. And the individual scope of practice of an RN and MP will be different for each MP or RN and will be dependent on the competencies that they gained from formal or informal education, skills acquired through nursing experience in various nursing domains, and services provided to diverse aggregate populations within their context of practice. So all that means is that the MP or the RN, when they go to a practice setting, they learn new knowledge, they gain new competencies. But that scope of practice is flexible and is almost like a balloon as it expands and contracts. So the scope of practice of the individual RN and MP fits within the scope of the profession as a whole and will always be smaller in comparison to the scope of the whole nursing profession. And the outer boundaries of the scope of practice of the individual nurse will always be flexible and will expand and contract over time based upon the required competencies and client needs for the individual nurse's practice setting. For example, as the individual nurse gains his experience and expertise in one particular practice setting, the outer boundaries of the scope of practice of that individual nurse may contract in regards to certain competencies that are rarely or never utilized, but expand as new competencies and expertise are gained in a particular practice setting. And an RN's MP scope of practice cannot progress beyond the profession scope of practice, but it do evolve over time as we gain new additional competencies as the context of practice changes. So for example, if you are wanting to learn about advanced foot care, you didn't learn it in your nursing education program, it's not in the basic education, entry to practice nursing education program, but you want to bring it in from that outer circle of the scope of practice. And so you're going to do formal education to learn how to do that. And so you bring it into your scope of practice. And when you graduated with all those entry-level competencies, some of them no longer exist if you haven't performed them into your practice setting. So as you can see, that white circle contracts and expands. And then the final circle, as I said, is the scope of practice of the profession. And what does that mean? Well, the scope of practice of the profession represents all that is taught into entry to practice nursing education programs, graduate nursing degree programs, and in continuing education programs. And it also includes competencies that are added to the role as the profession evolves in various practice settings and domains of practice to be responsive to the evolving healthcare environment and healthcare related needs of the public. So that larger circle is everything that's in the nursing profession. And we draw upon that as we gain new competencies and we bring it into our scope of practice of the individual RN and MP. So when we talk about scope, we often talk about scope, as I said, based on three principles, and those are three key elements. And those are education, authorization, and competence. So RNs and MPs determine their individual scope of practice when they're within their practice setting by reflecting on three key elements. Am I educated? Am I authorized? And am I competent? And before an RN or MP proceeds to perform a competency or an intervention, the RN and MP must first determine, so they stop and reflect, whether they have the necessary education and authorization, whether there is a legislated restriction to perform a competency, whether they have the individual competence and necessary knowledge, skills, judgment, and attributes to perform the competency for the client, and whether they can appropriately manage the outcomes of care in their practice setting. So let's look at, am I educated? So is the RN able to determine if they have the necessary education to perform the competency? So did the RN obtain the competency through their basic nursing education program, whether that be your RN or your MP program, or did they learn it through continuing education? And if it's through continuing education, we need to think about, did you or are you going to obtain that education? If you haven't learned it in nursing school, then you have to have that education some way. And we get that through continuing education. So that continuing education can be formal. You can do a course online through the CNA, through many different programs of getting formal education. It could be through your learning management system at your regional health authority. Or it could be informal. It could be your clinical educator is providing you information on a new pump, and also providing you some demonstration and return demonstration to learn how to use that new pump and review policies and the pump manual. But it's really important that whether it be formal and informal, that there be a theory component and a practical component. So it's not enough to be, if you haven't performed a competency before, to be pulled aside at the client's bedside and say, okay, we're now going to show you how to do this, and this is the education that you're going to get on that. We say that if you're going to bring it into your individual scope of practice, you must have theory and practical. There also has to be a method to validate the competence. So when someone demonstrates a competency to you and then you have to return demonstrate, how many times do you have to do that competency before you're deemed competent? Well, CRNNL doesn't set a limit to how that person, or how many number of times you have to perform that to validate that you're competent. In many circumstances, is the employer that would set that validation process, and how many times. Many places say it's 3 times or 5 times that you're able to do it competently, that you're deemed that you can perform that competency. And for nurse practitioners, currently, entry to practice education is specific for a certain category of practice, whether that you're in family all ages, adult, pediatric, neonatal, but in the future, it will be changing to one category of practice. So just a thought to reflect on your education program and what you're educated to do, and what types of continuing education that you will be required to seek out. The next thing to think about is, does the individual RN or MP have the appropriate authority to carry out activities within their nursing practice? And when we think about authorization, we think about 4 categories of authorization, and all must be in place for an RN or an MP to perform a nursing competency. So let's look at the first one, legislation or the law. So activities must be in accordance with the various federal or provincial laws that govern or direct nursing practice. So we had to consider, stop and reflect when we're thinking about, okay, I'm educated, I have that necessary education. Now, am I authorized? So is there something in law that says I can't do that competency? And for example, right now, RN prescribing is not in the RN regulations to say that you can perform prescribing. So it is coming, but right now, the RN is not recognized to have prescribing authority. MPs do. Then we look at the college or the CRNNL. So activities must be recognized by the college to be practiced as an RN and MP in Newfoundland and Labrador. And there's oftentimes the college might set specific education and practice requirements for a new or high-risk nursing competency prior to performance. And a good example is Suboxone and Methadone. In order for a nurse practitioner to be granted authority to prescribe Suboxone and Methadone, The MP has to complete specified education and practice requirements. So we have to think about, does the college say it's within the scope of practice of a registered nurse or nurse practitioner? And then we look at the employer. And so there's nothing in law that says you can do this skill. CRNNL says it's within the scope of the nursing profession. It doesn't say you can't do it. And then the employer, does the employer want you to do that in their organization? So activities must be authorized by the employer as approved nursing practice in the specific employment setting. And employer authorizations are often articulated in role and job descriptions, employer policies, medical directives, and we'll talk a little bit more about employer authorizations in the next slide. And then we look at the client. So this is a new element which is coming in the new document. And I put it there because we wouldn't be able to provide care to clients if we didn't have their consent. So when you're thinking about, am I authorized? The client, through informed consent or implied consent in some circumstances, gives you the authority to carry out those competencies. So, the client won't allow you to do it, then you can't perform those competencies. And then the third element is competent. Am I competent to do that? And RNs and MPs should stop and reflect whether they're competent and can they manage the outcomes of care of that particular competency in the particular practice setting that they are situated in. So RNs and MPs must determine whether they have the individual competence to perform a competency. They must determine whether they have the necessary knowledge, skills, judgment, and personal attributes such as attitudes, abilities, behaviors, and values to perform the particular competency for their client, and whether they can appropriately manage the outcomes of care in their practice setting. The RN and MP must consider if it's appropriate to perform that competency in their practice setting and whether they can manage if there's an adverse outcome of care. So if there's an unintended consequence of your care in the practice setting that you're in, can you manage that? There may be practice settings where it may not be appropriate to perform the nursing competency, for example, outside of an hospital or a clinic setting in a client's home. Let's think about PICC lines. You may be working on a unit in Eastern Health where you're able to take out PICC lines. In your practice setting, there's lots of resources there. If a client starts to hemorrhage, or then you can manage that care in that setting. But if you're doing public health or community care and you are taking out a PICC line in a client's care, if there's an unintended consequence, are you able to manage that outcome in that practice setting? So it's really important that consideration be given before you start or that competency in the setting that you're able to manage the unintended consequences when things go wrong. And can you manage them effectively? Do you have access to emergency equipment? And we have to think about everything that we do has to be in the best interest of the client and with the client's consent. So really important to think about those key questions. Am I educated? Am I authorized? Am I competent before I perform that competency? And if you're not sure, there's many resources that you can rely on. You can give us a call at the college. Peggy and I were nursing consultants for policy and practice. You might want to check with your clinical educator, your manager. Professional practice consultants can help you to determine, do you have employer policies to guide you in that? Is there a resource that could provide you the necessary education to acquire that competency? If it's something that's not currently in your practice setting, or for all of the nurses in your practice setting, there's a process in our scope of practice document that allows the RHA to bring new competencies into the scope of practice for RNs in a particular practice setting. And you can certainly review that in our document on the document on our practice resources under practice topics. So let's talk a little bit more on examples of employer authorization. And RNs and MPs are often authorized through employers to perform certain competencies. And some of those you're very familiar with would be employer policies. there's guidelines in your role or job description. It outlines what are the competencies that are expected of a particular RN and NP on a particular unit or within a particular program. There's medical directives, which authorizes RNs to perform competencies within their scope, that is within the scope of practice of RNs and NPs. And it would require a direct order for you to perform that. But a medical directive is created by the RHA to allow you to do a certain number of competencies that are not client specific, that you follow that medical directive to the T, and the responsibility of that medical directive lies with the authorized prescriber, but you're allowed to do things that you ordinarily wouldn't do, but is within the scope of an RN. Then there's pre-printed orders, and these are client specific, and these are orders that are predetermined, and an authorized prescriber would check off what are those competencies or things that the authorized prescriber wants you to perform for that particular client. And they're often kept on the client's chart because they are client specific. And we have a document on our practice resources under practice topics called medical directives and pre-printed orders for more information. Then there's another form of authorization, which is delegation. And under delegation, in certain circumstances, clients' healthcare needs require competencies that are beyond or outside the nursing scope of practice and can only be authorized to be performed through a delegation of function from another healthcare professional. And that generally is the regulatory body or government through a legislative change. For example, right now, prescribing is within the domain of physicians, nurse practitioners, dentists, pharmacists, vets, and an RN is not recognized as an authorized prescriber. In order for that to be brought into the scope of a registered nurse, there has to be a legislative change. So competencies that are outside or beyond the scope of practice of RNs, a non-delegated competency, are activities that are legislated to be exclusively within the scope of a specific health professional. In Newfoundland, and delegation. So in order for that to come into the scope of an RN, delegation or an NP, delegation is a formal process and involves the legal transfer of authority to perform a specific function in selected situations. So delegation allows that RN and NP to perform a specific nursing activity, skill, or procedure that is beyond that RN or NP's traditional role and basic responsibilities. So again, those authority to perform that competency is delegated through a legislative change or a formal delegation from the authorized prescriber or health professional group to nursing. So an example would be, you may be in a remote area in Labrador, and there's an emergency, and the nurse, the RN, is not within their competency to perform an ultrasound, but the physician or nurse practitioner may, through virtual nursing practice, may be on FaceTime and lead you through how to do that skill. So it's not within the scope, it's not going to be within the scope of an RN, but for that perspective, it is being delegated at that time. And then the last form of authorization, and I should say before I go on to assignment of care, is that for more information on delegation, you can find that in our scope of practice document and in the new upcoming documents. Then the assignment of care. So the RN and NP is authorized to perform care for the client through an assignment of care. So this is where an RN or an NP assigns care and determines who's the right healthcare provider for the client in the right place at the right time for the right reason, and considers a number of factors: the acuity or complexity of the client's condition, the client's plan of care, predictability of the outcomes of care, the competency level of the healthcare providers, and expertise of individual healthcare providers, the context of practice, and the availability of resources and supports. So you can see that when you start a shift and what your competencies are, and that authorization to perform certain competencies or RN competencies or nurse practitioner competencies are authorized through the employer in a number of ways. So there are circumstances where we share competencies with other healthcare practitioners. And in a collaborative healthcare team, RNs and NPs will find themselves in situations where they share competencies with other healthcare professionals. RNs practice encompass, and we're going to talk about licensed practical nurses, and RN's practice encompasses all competencies that are within LPN practice, and therefore there are circumstances where there are competencies where both LPNs and RNs possess, and some of those are like administering medications, assignment, catheter care, assessment. Most recently, they have added to the competency framework of LPNs, central venous access devices, so caring for PICC lines. During the pandemic, we had LPNs and RNs and NPs working together to do COVID-19 swabs, COVID-19 immunizations, vaccinations. LPNs can do blood and blood products now. So we share many competencies with other healthcare professionals. We may share competencies with physiotherapy, doing chest physio, with RTs. So it's something to consider that not only do we have our individual competencies, we have shared competencies. But then our scope of practice differs with licensed practical nurses, and that's based on the depth and breadth of each of our education programs and through legislation. Our legislation lays out what are the differences between those two disciplines of nurses. Through education, LPNs graduate from a 5-semester, 18-month diploma program, and RNs now graduate from a 9-semester, 5-year Bachelor of Science degree program. And the application of knowledge for RNs is more in-depth and comprehensive, which is reflected in a broader scope of practice for RNs. And as you'll see that NPs share competencies with RNs because NPs first are RNs, and then do an education program, an NP level education program, and are then licensed as nurse practitioners. So as you can see within the different disciplines of nursing that we do share competencies, but there are others that are different for each of those disciplines. So a little bit about NP scope of practice. So nurse practitioners are RNs with advanced education preparation and experience, which enables them to autonomously diagnose, treat, and manage acute and chronic mental and physical illnesses. And NPs use their in-depth knowledge and clinical knowledge to analyze, synthesize, and apply evidence to make decisions about their client care. And they apply theory and knowledge from nursing and other disciplines to provide a comprehensive range of essential health services grounded in professional, ethical, and legal standards within a holistic and integrated model of care. So our NPs have advanced competencies and differ from the RNs. And in our standards of practice, you'll see that RNs and NPs share 4 standards, but the last 3 are specific to the advanced competencies for nurse practitioners. So, which reflects a difference in their scope of practice. So NP scope of practice, and what do we say at the college about NP scope of practice? Well, NPs are authorized to independently perform a range of health services that extend beyond those of registered nurses. They possess the competency to provide comprehensive health assessments, identify health risks and health needs. They diagnose diseases, disorders, injuries, and conditions. They discuss health assessment results, diagnosis, prognosis, and outcomes with clients and/or healthcare team. And currently, there are no legislative restrictions on the NP authority to perform these activities. So there are some, I guess, things for the NP to think about when they're thinking about their individual scope of practice. And an NP must restrict their practice to performing activities that the individual nurse practitioner is competent to perform. So do they have the necessary knowledge, skills, and abilities to provide that specific competency, and to activities that are appropriate to their client population and practice setting. So as I said at the beginning, NPs achieve a nursing program that is specific to a category of practice. So if you're family all ages, you have a specific client population. If you're adult NP, you have a specific population. And if you're pediatric or neonatal. So they must also limit their activities to and procedures to what complies with the standards of practice for registered nurses and nurse practitioners, to relevant legislation and the policies of the healthcare organization and employer. So it's really important to know that. And one piece of legislation, just as an example, is the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. So the authority for NPs to prescribe meds is very, very broad, and there's very few restrictions on what an NP can prescribe. But under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the NP cannot prescribe anabolic steroids other than testosterone. They cannot prescribe coca, and they cannot, which is like the cocaine leads, and they can't prescribe a medication with opium. And as I said previously, in order for an NP to prescribe Suboxone and methadone, they must be granted authority by the college after they have completed specific education and practice requirements. So within the legislation, the NP scope of practice is very clearly articulated. And as I guess, a reflective statement, and within the standards of practice, NPs need to limit their competencies that they perform to their individual level of competence, their category of practice, and their practice setting. And within the RN regulations, is section 14, is that NPs are authorized to order the application of a form of energy permitted by the standards established by the council. So this is what government says NPs can do. And forms of energy include, but are not limited to, a CAT scan, an MRI, a PET scan, an ultrasound, chest X-ray, just to name a few. NPs can order laboratory or other tests permitted by the standards established by the council, and they can prescribe a drug permitted by the standards established by the council. So that's right out of the RN regulations. So it's really important that NPs are aware of what they're authorized to perform. And for further detail, they can refer to their standards of practice document. So this is where a piece of legislation defines what is in the scope of practice of a nurse practitioner, and all of the college's documents further elaborate on what that means. I also talked about the categories. So in the adult category of practice for a nurse practitioner, which limits who they can care for, an NP provides care for an individual 18 years of age and older in a generalized adult practice where they see adults with a variety of medical conditions and or adults in a generalized or specialty practice setting. And in some cases, care of older adolescents may be provided when the adolescent's age and or condition may be closely approximate that of an adult. And if you have any questions, you can certainly touch base with us at the college. At Family All Ages provide care for clients across the lifespan, including newborns, children, adolescents, adults, pregnant and postpartum women, and older adults in a generalized or a specialty practice setting. And then pediatric provides care for individuals under the age of 18 in either a generalized practice where they see individuals with a variety of medical conditions, or individuals in a generalized or specialty practice setting. And again, in this category, in some circumstances, they can provide care to young adults whose developmental age may closely approximate that of a child or an adolescent rather than an adult, or a young adult who has been receiving care from the nurse practitioner pediatrics for a chronic disease since childhood. So again, if you have any questions, you can touch base with us. And under pediatric, we license nurse practitioners as neonatal practitioners. But these are neonatal nurse practitioners are registered within the pediatric category and have specialized education relevant to the neonatology. So as you can see, you may have all the education, but in this circumstance, you can only practice and perform those competencies based on the category of practice that you're licensed in. And so an adult NP would not be able to provide care in specific family settings where there would be children under the age of 18, because an adult is for 18 and above. So just some thoughts to reflect on. The scope of practice of NP, it is limited by their category of practice. So here you'll see a collage, I guess, of circles. And what it reflects is that RNs and NPs work within collaborative interprofessional teams. And that could include physicians, RNs, LPNs, nurse practitioners, unregulated care providers or PCAs, allied health, such as social work, OT, physio, RTs. There could be surgeons. So there's many people that make up a collaborative team, and members of a collaborative interprofessional team will have individual scopes of practice. And often you'll see that competencies will overlap or are shared within each of these healthcare professionals, such as RNs and LPNs, NPs and RNs, LPNs, RNs, and unregulated care providers or PCAs. So in this diagram, you'll see the individual scopes of practice, those individual circles, but you'll also see circles that overlap, which indicates that they're shared. It is this collaboration and individual scopes of practice that carry out the client's plan of care and contribute to meeting the client's care needs. But it's really important as a practitioner, as an individual RN and NP, to know the individual scopes of practice of all of those healthcare professionals within the team and determine when collaboration, consultation, or referral or transfer of care is required. So it's really important that you know your individual scope of practice, but also the individual scopes of practice of all of those that you collaborate within your practice setting and your collaborative interprofessional team. So professional practice, professional nursing practice. So an expectation for professional nursing practice is that you attain your entry-level competencies. You uphold, your standards of nursing practice, but you practice within your individual scope of practice and reflecting on, do I have the necessary knowledge, skills, and judgment to carry out that particular competency? Can I manage the outcomes? And then reflect on, am I educated to do that competency? Do I have the appropriate authorization to carry out that competency? Is there anything in law that's preventing me to do that? Is there anything in law that is allowing me to do it and I don't have authorization, so I'm going to advocate for that? Is there anything at the college that says I can or can't do that? Is there anything in the employer policy that says I can do that in my practice setting? Or is it something that you need to advocate to your employer to say, I don't have a policy that authorizes me to do this competency. I have the education, but we need a policy. So you need to speak to your manager or professional practice to advocate to get that policy. And as I said, you need to reflect on, if I have that within my individual competence, I'm reflecting on my practice setting to say, can I manage the outcomes? Can I carry out that competency safely? And can I manage the outcomes of that care, particularly if there's an adverse event or an unintended consequence of that care? And so we're dependent and that you have those reflections and you pause and think before you move forward in performing a competency when you're unsure of are you allowed to do that? And remember, everything you do is in the best interest of the client. Is it in the best interest of the client to proceed to do a competency when you aren't educated, when you aren't authorized, when you're not sure if this is the appropriate setting to be performing that competency. So it's incumbent on you as a professional registered nurse or nurse practitioner to pause, reflect, and to determine if am I educated, am I authorized, and am I competent, and can I manage the outcomes? And if you're not sure, it's incumbent on you to find out. You have a responsibility and accountability to find out, are you allowed to perform that competency in your practice setting? So I talked to you a little bit that CRNNL has a new website. We also have some new social media handles where you can connect with us. We will be sending out information through our new Facebook account. We do tweets through Twitter. We have an Instagram account. We have our YouTube account. And then there is our contact information of our main line is 753-6040 and our toll-free number. And also to access any of the documents that I referred to today. As I said, it's on our website under practice resources, and they're found under practice topics or trending topics. So feel free to connect with Peggy and I if you have questions on scope, and it's incumbent that if you're unsure to connect with us and also those resources that you have at your means within your regional health authorities.